everyone, and welcome to another episode of Respecting the Beer. My name is Gary Arndt. With me, again, as usual, is the historian of hops, Joel Hermansen, and the man who just joined the new cover band, Tom Petty and the Beer Makers, Mr. Bobby Fleshman.
Nice.
We got a great interview today. Coming to us all the way from the United Kingdom is the former brewmaster at Fuller's, John Keeling, a man who's probably forgotten more about beer than we know. John, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't we get started? Why don't you just briefly kind of give us your story about how you got started in beer and brewing?
The official story or the unofficial story?
The unofficial one's probably more interesting.
Well, what happened was I left school when I was just over 16. And I didn't want to go back to school. And I didn't quite tell my mother I was doing that. And eventually she got fed up with me hanging around the house. And she said, well, if you're not going back to school, you better get a job. And I was not keen on that either. But she said, but fortunately, she'd got me an interview at the local brewery. So I went along for this interview, and lo and behold, I got the job at the local brewery, which was in Manchester, where I'm born. And it was Wilson's Brewery in Newton Heath, Manchester. And they were part of the Watney Group way back in the 70s. And I got the job, and I liked it so much, I wanted to do that for the rest of my life. So after a couple of years at Wilson's, I left Wilson's to go and study at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh for a degree in brewing and distilling, which I got. And then, so 3 years after of study at Heriot-Watt, and then I got a job at Fuller's Brewery as a junior brewer, and I was there for 38 years, and 19 years as their brewing director, head brewer.
If you're Manchester, I have to ask, do you support City or United?
United.
All right. Just
as did my father before me. It's a well-known fact that Manchester City fans think they're Mancunian, but they really all come from Stockport. They see the Reds that come from Manchester. That's a little football joke for all you football fans.
Right. I'm sure you know Charlie.
Charlie, son.
Bamford.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do know Charlie. The Pope of Foam.
Yeah, I would imagine that we would have some soccer, football discussions if you were here. We would derail.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I don't know what you have there, Gary. Maybe how we quote met. I was on a podcast called Brewer's Journal, I think it was, maybe 5 years ago. And the producer, after the fact, connected me and you by email for whatever reason. He thought that our passion for cask married with yours. And so I reached out, and I've asked you for advice over the years on ordering hops and how to use them, et cetera, in these English beers. And the opportunity came up for the Great Taste of Wisconsin, or it's Great Taste of the Midwest.
In Madison?
Yeah, in Madison, Wisconsin. They were wanting us to reach out to brewers outside of the state for collaborations. It's the largest beer fest, I think, outside of the Great American Beer Festival in the United States. In any case, I went farther than that, reached out to you in London or in England to maybe pull this together remotely. And I guess we'll get into how Fuller's made beer and how we tried to simulate it. But yeah, that's sort of it. We've never physically met, and we hope to get you here stateside soon at some point to see what we've done. But in the meantime, this is a beer we did virtually together.
That would be nice. It would be nice to see you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So do you want to talk about how Fuller's makes beer and how they've made beer historically? It's a unique process.
Yeah, well, there's lots of different ways to make beer and little variations on how you make beer. And I used to say to people that my job is not to be the best brewer in the world. My job is to be the best Fuller's brewer in the world, because the way Fuller's make beer is different from other people. The way Adnams makes beer is different from other brewers. The way St. Austell make beer is different from others. So when you go and work for these companies, you've got to get used to the company, get used to their style, how they make beer, and immerse yourself in that, because it is part of the culture. When I was first at Fuller's, Fuller's was really a London brewery at that point. We had gone a little bit out of London, but we were still a London brewery. And drinking in Fuller's pubs was like supporting your local football team. People who drank Fuller's thought that Fuller's was the best beer in the world. They didn't drink a great deal of anybody else's. They drank Fuller's. And I think where I was from in Manchester, Boddington's was the best beer because that's what Manchester people like to drink in. Your local brewery, you immerse yourself in the culture of that and the culture of the pubs. And then gradually Fuller's became bigger and bigger. And we spread our style of beer around the world. You know, and one of the most famous beers of ours was ESB, Fuller's ESB, and that became a style in its own right. Originally, it was just one beer. It wasn't a style. But Fuller's way of making beer goes back to the Victorian era of making beer. We use a system called the party guile system, which really means that you have 2 mash tuns and 2 coppers. You mash in first thing in the morning, both mash tuns at the same time, and you then run off both at the same time, and they fill copper number 1. Copper number 1 is therefore very strong because it gets all the first runnings from the mash tun. And then when copper 1 is full, you start that to boil and then continue filling copper number 2. Copper number 2 becomes quite weak because it has the last runnings from the mash tun. And to get the different styles of the different types of Fuller's beer, so we would make a beer called Chiswick Bitter, a beer called London Pride, and ESB, all from that same mash. And we did that by blending the 2 coppers together in fermenting vessel and then adding the yeast and fermenting. The other thing we did, we would add 2/3 of all the hops to the first copper and 1/3 to the second copper. And that's because we wanted the stronger beers to have more bitterness than the weaker beers. And also, I think the hops optimize better in weaker worts as well. So you would get a proportionally more bitter second wort, which we didn't want so much. So we put 2/3 of the hops. This was developed over, they first started party guiling in about the late 1800s, early 1900s. Then it evolved and become, when I left, it was fully automated, computer run, and everything, nothing could go wrong once you'd committed to making the beer, unless the plant and machinery broke down. In the early days, it was very hands-on, a very manual job. In fact, when we come to reviewing the brewing records in my time there, we was looking to make beers from the past. We call them past masters. And we wanted to make the exact same recipe in the place where it was made originally. And that brought forth a lot of different beers that we brewed. And I realized at that time as well that people must have an emotional connection to beer. And that brought it home to me, brewing those beers from the past. I just thought we were just going to do recipes. But then we picked a recipe to brew from 1914, which was the beginning of the First World War. And this recipe we made, and partway through making it, people started talking about the First World War and saying, you know, this beer we made, which would have been drunk by all the troops in Middlesex and in Surrey, it was stationed there going out to the Second World War, because that's where Fuller's was strong. All those troops would have drank that beer. It might have been the last beer they drank. It might have been the last British beer they drank, certainly. And that gives you an emotional attachment to that beer. There was another beer we made from 1966. We wanted to brew this because England won their only Football World Cup in 1966. And We wanted to prove that because we wanted to recognize that fact. And then one of the old brewers who was just about to retire tapped me on the shoulder when I was looking at this recipe. And he said, John, you know what? I brewed that beer on that day. And he had made that beer, so we made him make the next beer, which is the one for the past masters. So Brendan, who was one of our brewers, he'd made the beer in 1966 that we decided to call a past mastered, which again, just it shows that connection you have through history when you make beer. And we've been making this beer, in this party-gal system since the late 1800s. And we still do that today. We make other types of beer as well. But that's the main type of beer that we make is on the party-gal system, which was a Victorian invention, really to get the best out of mash tuns. Because mash tuns were the only way of making beer in the late 1800s. That was a standard way of making beer. The Lauter tuns were certainly not in British brewing. They might have been in European brewing. And mash filters were not in British brewing. They were not invented for another 100 and so years. But mash tuns were the old-fashioned way of making beer. And it's also, what was good about mash tuns, I feel, it's a very calm situation. You don't rag the bed, you don't stir it or anything like that. And so when you get wort off and when it runs properly, it becomes very clear because the mash itself forms its own filter. And if you don't disturb it, that filter runs all the time you're running the mash tun. And it gives you a very clear wort, which helps cask beer because cask beer is not filtered. So if you bring a lot of cloudiness out of your mash, you're going to get that in the end product as well. And people wanted a clear beer. And that's why the mash tuns were so good at making cask beer, which was, for hundreds of years, the traditional beer of Britain. And it still is really the traditional beer, but it's not the most popular beer anymore. But
how is cask doing today? I hear it's down and it's down, but then occasionally I hear that it's maybe coming back up, and I'm thinking about it in England.
I mean, in Britain, full stop is really the only place you can get cask beer. I know other sure. breweries do it, but it's really just to their tap rooms and etc. It's not widely distributed as it is in Britain, and Britain has the malt for it, the mash tuns for it. It has we're neither cool or hot in our weather, so it is the ideal temperature for making cask beer and storing it and distributing it. It's not too cold. Cask beer does not like being freezing cold, and it does not like being too warm either. It's got to be in that correct temperature range. What is it doing in Britain? I think in Britain now, it's really the beer of specialist breweries, specialist pubs, and specialist beer drinkers. Probably it's, of the total beer sales in Britain, 4 to 5% of the total beer sales. It's about 8 to 9%, maybe even 10% of the total beer sold in pubs. So, you know what? When I started drinking beer, it was 40% of the beer.
Right. John, I wanted to ask a quick question. First of all, thanks for being here. It's a privilege to talk with you. Your reputation it precedes you. We do a lot at McFleshman's focusing on history. So listening to your story about the past masters and the soldiers in Middlesex, et cetera, going off and having their last beers is pretty inspirational for us. But I know that isn't your whole story, because I know you're also someone who has overseen the transition of Fuller's to a larger, more modern brewery as well. So I'm wondering if you can, in addition to the historical, if you can talk a little bit about the science and technology that you ushered in at Fuller's.
Yeah, I think if you look back at Fuller's, we used to use open squares. Our mash tun was built in the 1860s. Everything was old and wet.
Where is that mash tun these days? I have to interrupt. Where did that equipment end up?
It's still there. We still keep.
It's still there.
keep some of it in a museum. They sort of like there's bits and pieces all dotted around the tour. So in between all the modern plan, you have some of the old plan which is left, so that people who come on the tour of Fuller's, and I recommend it to go home when you're in London, is you will see the old equipment as well as the new equipment, so you can see how we used plant in 50 years ago and how we use it today. And I think that the difference between the two is the automation that's come in. The fermenters have gone to enclosed fermentation. We found that we started using them in the 70s and eventually became 100% enclosed fermentation. Our yeast prefers enclosed fermentation than it did the open squares. I used to speak to the old brewers who used to brew on the open squares, and they brewed on the conicals as well. And we moved all to the conicals for the reason we thought it made better beer. But they said, once in a blue moon, the open squares would produce the best beer. But it also, more often than not, produced the worst beer. And for sheer consistency, the enclosed fermentation vessels were much superior. And I think that is, if there's anything, what sum up in one word, the change of Fuller's is inconsistency. And that's brought about by modern equipment, modern plant, designing recipes around that modern plant. So if you say we are going to boil for an 8% boil off, the computer says we've now just hit 8%. There's no guessing in that. I also remember talking and reading old brewing books, and this is the revolution, the evolution of brewing has occurred ever since we started brewing. But how did they know the right temperature to mash in when they mashed in without a thermometer, when thermometers weren't invented? How did they know that? And the answer in those old books was the water was at the right temperature to mash when it showed you the reflection of your face the best. So if you could see your face in the water the best, you knew you had the right temperature to mash in, which is an amazing fact. And what is also an amazing fact, when thermometers were invented, brewers did not want to use them. And why was that? Because it took away a skill that they had. Nobody else knew the right temperature, only the brewer. Yeah, but when a thermometer was invented, it was easy to know when the right temperature. And I think that's what Fuller's did during my time there. We moved to make more consistent beer and also a longer shelf life beer. The beer didn't go off as quickly because we brewed it better and better. And we use modern science to inform us on how to do that, especially, say, for small pack. You know, how to produce a beer for small pack that will last 6 months. It's much different from producing a cask beer which you want to last 4 weeks. And it's different. So, and the science teaches you the differences, what you have to remove from the beer to make sure it doesn't go off. For instance, the role of oxygen in the brewing process. Again, lots of people think oxygen is so negative, it produces poor flavors. But when we started bottling conditioning our beers, and the most famous one we do is vintage ale or 1845, we found that they were better after 12 months than they were after 1 month. And we found that, in actual fact, my favorite vintages are often more than 10 years old. And that was the role of oxygen in aging. And if the oxygen, to me, if the oxidation is slow and lengthy and measured in years rather than weeks, it produces a much better flavor than when you accelerate the oxidation process. So by having too much oxygen in there. And again, the bottle conditioned beers have yeast in them, which constantly mop up any oxygen that comes past the cap on the bottle top. So measuring and understanding the role of oxygen in beer flavor, I think, again, science has shed that light on that. And brewing science has gone forward in leaps and bounds, even from when I started in the 70s. And I think one of the reasons why this is a lot of the science in the 70s was designed to remove flavor from beer so that it was easier to hold for 12 months. Making a beer consistent is easier if it hasn't got a lot of flavor. With the advent of craft beer, we wanted beer with flavor. And again, that gives us a different problem. How do you make a beer with all these flavors in last 6 months? Because flavors constantly change. It's the biochemical change in the beer flavors, and also the biological, if you have yeast in there as well. And how do you manage that? And the conclusion I came to is you've got to seek to make those changes positive rather than negative. Beer will change in flavor. When you taste the beer at 3 years old and having tasted the same beer at 1 month old, it will change in flavor. There's nothing you can do to stop that. And instead of trying to...
How many thoughts do you have going through your head right now after that?
You know me well.
Yeah, I do.
I don't even know where to go because there's so many ways to go with that. I would say one thing we did was with this collaboration, we used Fuller's yeast for the first time at this brewery. We generally use Timothy Taylor, and because we get open fermentation on all of our English ales. And I will say that it does manifest very differently in that open. It does the Fuller strain. I was surprised. I'm always surprised when we see like how they manifest on the surface and how you can tell just by looking at that which you're working with. But it's funny you would say that maybe one has been sort of selected at this point for closed fermentation.
Yes. But again, one of the things, I mean, I've worked a lot on this aspect. And when we took over a brewery called Gales, who were open fermentation as well, and we converted them to being an enclosed fermentation. And what you have to do is you have to look in a common sense way at fermentation. All fermentation out is not top or bottom. It actually happens in the middle. Yeah, that's where the yeast ferments. What happens, it either settles at the bottom or it floats to the top. And you skim from the top to collect your yeast, or you collect from the bottom. And what I observed in using open squares was there was a lot of yeast at the bottom after we emptied the vessel. So I knew some of our yeast was settling at the bottom as well as floating on the top. If you select the bottom yeast, eventually you will convert it into a bottom collection. And that's what we did with both the Fuller's yeast and the Gales yeast. So you can select to make it. So to reselect the yeast to be a top fermenting yeast, all you do is you collect the yeast that floats to the top. And when you open up a Fuller's conical, you will see yeast on the top. It'd be a thin layer, but you will see it. And if we collected that yeast, we could turn the Fuller's yeast into a top collection yeast where a lot of yeast is at the top instead of just the thin layer.
This is turning into a multi-generational collaboration. I can see we'll select a couple times over. That's a rabbit hole I'd love to dive down. My wife is not here with us, but if she were, there would be 2 against 1, I think, when it comes to cast sitting at the table here. 3, including yourself. And Joel is, we were talking a little bit about this, how you guys are the yin and yang of beer.
Yeah, I was reading a quote that you had from 2015, and I'll quote you right here. For example, you said, "But for some people, their prejudice won't allow them to taste and like a good beer, and you can't win with people like that." I don't want to say I'm the person like that, but I'm probably the person like that. I'm not a prejudicial drinker. I
prefer the term
appreciate
simple man.
Yeah, right.
Or simpleton, whichever you.
Thank you. Yeah, I can appreciate the merits of cask beer. It's just not something that I like.
I've got two answers.
I'm a monochromatic guy.
I've got two answers. Answers to that is, firstly, there is only actually two types of beer in the world. Yeah, there's beers I like and beers I don't, and those are the only two types. And the second thing is, if you don't like cask beer, it's you have to work hard to try and like it. So, if you were to drink just a half pint every night for 12 months, you would like it.
Okay.
It'd be a long 12 months for you, but you'll get there.
And part of it, and like, I don't like coffee either. I'm a strange person when it comes to drinks. I don't like coffee. You're going to hate me for this too. I don't like tea. I don't like warm things.
Okay, well,
when I'm drinking something, I really only drink four things. I drink water, I drink milk, I drink fruit juices, and I drink West Coast IPAs. That's the extent. That's like the extent of it.
Well, I suppose if you were going to only pick four, well, that's not bad four.
Right.
Well, and I would say that I was already in love with Sam Smith and Fuller's when my wife and I made a trip to England in 2008. And at that point, I think it seeded the beginnings in our minds of what became this brewery. And I got to experience cask in a way that you can't convey in words. I got to be in these pubs across, and you get to be a part of the community in a certain way. So we were thinking about building our tap room, and if you look online, you can see pictures of it, to try to do the best we could to transport what you might find in England or Ireland or Scotland back here, and then brew beers that would do them justice. Speaking of which, we just got a silver at the U.S. Open for our English IPA.
Well, that's good.
Again, one in which that I've communicated with you about, and you told me to stop. I think you did not say stop fucking with it, but a lot of people do say that to me. So I did, and it succeeded. I don't know where I'm going there. I guess I was trying to say though that Allison, my wife, and I, we have a different introduction to cask than people who've not been able to experience that.
Well,
and I'm,
beer is such a social thing. And I think one of the great sadnesses to me is the fact that now, over 50% of beer drunk in the UK is drunk at home. And I would much prefer if 20% of the beer was drunk at home and 80% was drunk in the pub, because drinking with friends in the pub, to me, is the best way of experiencing beer. And to do that, I think is a great thing because...
And sadly, that's going to wrap up this episode of Respecting the Beer. The producer of the show is me, David Kelso, with music by Sarah Lynn Huss. Come back in 2 weeks to hear the rest of the conversation with John Keeling, as next week we'll be celebrating Oktoberfest with a special episode. If you want to hear the full conversation with John Keeling right now, you can head on over to Patreon, and support at any level gets you access to fully uncut episodes. We've also got a video tour of the brewery coming very soon, so if you'd like to see everything that happens behind the scenes, guided by Bobby and Allison themselves, support us over there. Otherwise, you can stay up to date between episodes over in our Facebook group, and until next time, please remember to respect the beer.